Well, welcome everyone. It's been a few weeks since we spoke. I've been sending out a few email updates over the last few weeks, but it has gone a little bit quiet. But I think we're now at the business end of the season. With the next 2 months in particular, we're going to be very busy dealing with the policy statement and then dealing with the autumn budget, the provisional settlement, and the final settlement. So we really are going to start moving quite quickly now. This afternoon, rather, it's normally this morning, but it is this afternoon. I'm going to take us through a look ahead at what might be in the policy statement, the key document that we expect before the provisional settlement. Then Stuart's going to give us some commentary from his point of view on the policy statement and on the process more generally, what might happen.
This is my 2 o'clock thing we're talking about.
Oh,
yeah.
I think someone's on. If you could mute yourself, that would be great. Thank you. And then I'll come back, and for the final part of the session, we will look a bit more about the MTFP model, updating the autumn budget and the business rate retention system as well. So quite a lot as ever to get through today. But to begin with, the policy statement, speculation, expectations, model updates, a whole range of things that we need to think about in advance of the policy statement. The consultation paper, as we know, was out at the end of June, and we spent a lot of the summer trying to model that and work out what was going on. And our model hasn't changed much since, I think, the 17th of July. So we've kept that pretty steady. We've issued some updates based on bits of ad hoc guidance we've had from MHCLG and other bits of information we picked up from other sources. It's mostly really around giving you an understanding or insight into what we think the ongoing variables and uncertainties might be, rather than we certainly haven't tried not to change our default assumptions for the forecast for 26, 27 and beyond. So the policy statement we're expecting relatively soon, probably next week, beginning the 17th of November. The autumn budget is on the 26th, the week after, if that's the case. And then the provisional settlement in the week beginning the 15th of December. So in essence, the week before Christmas. So it's now customary slot just before Christmas. The final settlement sometime in early February. But we're not expecting any formal exemplifications from MHCLG until the provisional settlement itself in late December. So what we would expect, though, is to get updates on RNFs and the other key assumptions from the policy statement, and from that we will be updating our model and issuing a new default forecast for you within the modelling. There's been a lot of speculation. I don't know how well informed it is. Some people tell me it is pretty well informed, so we have to take it as that it is well informed. But quite a few things are going on here. A lot of it is London councils really trying to put pressure on ministers to make changes in the funding formulas that have been proposed. And really, the shorthand has been to talk about London, but really what we're talking about here is Inner London. Inner London is the class of authority that's lost the most and has most to gain from any changes. And I imagine it's been putting a lot of pressure on ministers. They also have a few influential MPs within Inner London that may have been receptive to conversations as well. But that's really been a lot of the narrative, that ministers have been looking at ways to help out London and Inner London in particular. And a lot of pushback, obviously, from SEGOMA, Metropolitan authorities, who, to be fair, I think Metropolitan authorities had a relatively underwhelming outcome from the June consultation. So, SEGOMA is being defensive, trying to protect what it's got, but also trying to increase its share of funding at the same time as well. So I think ministers have got those two very distinctive kind of voices in their ears about what should happen. London put a lot of pressure on about the new IMD, which we'll look at, and that will make quite a big difference, I think. And also looking at changing definitions around daytime visitors and also resident population too. The IMD was a big deal, and I think we'll see it's a really big deal when we see the revised numbers coming out in the policy statement. Some of the commentary, I think, probably got it a bit wrong, talking about that the big gainers were in Tunbridge Wells and Buckinghamshire. I think the big shift really is that there's a movement down, a lower relative deprivation in metropolitan authorities, higher relative deprivation in London, which was the opposite of what we were expecting, and that will have an impact on the distribution of funding that we'll see in the next week or so. The remoteness factor was also an issue that was mentioned in the press coverage. This was something that I think a lot of London boroughs, London councils, and SOGOMA and metropolitan authorities put a lot of pressure on ministers about. So obviously that's one thing that they've been that's appeared in the press as being something that they'll want to look at. We don't think they'll get rid of it, but it'll be probably a downgrading of that factor. Just to remind ourselves some context about what our modelling showed us based on what was in that June consultation. So we saw some really big losses for most in the London boroughs from those consultation proposals. Outer London, in contrast, was doing pretty well. Big shifts in funding towards the metropolitan authorities, but the gains were probably a bit less than we'd expected and a bit less than the Mets and SOGOMA had expected as well. So as I said, it's a little bit underwhelming. Small increases for shire counties and for county unitaries, and relatively big decreases for shire districts. Although, as we mentioned in our commentary at the time, some of the increases for shire districts were quite a lot bigger than we'd expected, for various reasons, mostly around the weighting of the RNFs. And of course, we've got a new set of ministers now compared to those ministers who were in charge of the consultation. These new ministers, the Secretary of State, the Minister for Local Government, have both got strong background in inner London, and so obviously will be much more sensitive to what's happening there. But the challenge there really is for ministers to look after London to some degree, and also make sure that metropolitan areas feel that they've got something out of the process too, but at the same time making sure that counties don't feel like they've been squeezed too much or at all. I'll flick over this one fairly quickly, but the key points here, just to remind ourselves, were that the big gains for metropolitan authorities was from the resource adjustment from council tax equalisation. Gains in Met areas from the needs shares were pretty small. The opposite was the case for shire counties. Big gains on the needs shares, biggish losses on the resources adjustment. So the inverse there for shire counties. Shire districts losing on the baseline reset, losing on the needs shares as well, but gaining on other factors, particularly around the weightings. Inner London, on the extreme of things, pretty much losing from everything, but particularly losing from the new needs shares. So looking ahead for the policy statement, we've got a checklist really of things that we're looking out for. Starting off with the quantum, our starting point, as everyone's should be really, is the spending review 2025. But we're not quite sure exactly how much resource is within the quantum. Range between 2.3 or 3.3 billion. We think now it's towards the top end, depending on what the council tax assumptions are, but we don't know yet what will be funded from that quantum, how much of the new burdens will be funded from that. And then the relative needs formulas, a whole range of updates and changes here that will flow through and will have potentially biggish impacts on your share from these RNFs, the population, IMD, remoteness, changes in weighting, changes in other population measures. The RNF weightings as well, they'll be updated based on the latest spending patterns. There were also some methodology issues there as well, and that's the biggest risk area for district councils. Then the resources deduction, we need confirmation about exactly what the Band D figure is. Quoted £2,000, but we're running with a figure slightly below that. I think 1998 is out the figure we've got modelled. And also, what's the assumed increase in future years? Then what's the government's view on using projections of data rather than fixed allocations? And then we'd expect to see quite a lot of change around the damping and the funding floors. There were some really big methodological weaknesses in that damping floor, which I think will need to be ironed out, as well as the definition of what's in the baselines, etc. So just covering again, looking at the quantum and how the new burdens would fit in with this. As I mentioned, and this is what's in the model as well on the right hand side, we had assumed that council tax within core spending power would increase by 6.2% per year, in line with the settlement assumptions, and that would result in a cumulative increase in growth and grant funding and SFA of 2.3 billion over those 3 years. Looking at other modelling and speaking to the IFS as well, their view is that the assumed council tax growth is more like 5.5%, in line with the OBR's forecasts, and that would result in a 3.3 billion cumulative increase in grant funding. So I'm erring now towards the latter of those two, the higher figure, the 3.3 billion. But what's really crucially important there is what is funded from that? How much of that is going to be funding that you'll need for new burdens, particularly things like food waste, which we know is funded from the settlement? What other new burdens are in there that you need to fund as well? We need more detail on that. Will there be any policy changes in the autumn budget week after next that we'll need to profile in? There could be things there, around pensions changes, etc., that might result in costs to councils. Will you be expected to fund that from the increase in resources within core spending power as well, or will there be further funding made available? And then also, what's the effect of the higher than expected CPI, 3.8%, rather than the forecasts that were available at the time of the spending review, more like 2%? So, will those higher than expected CPI forecasts have any bearing on core spending power? We don't think it will, but we need to make sure of that. So what updates in the policy statement are we expecting, and what effect do we think that will have? So our view is that, this is how we expressed it in our emails over the last few weeks, that any funding distribution changes should be fairly limited. Most of them should be really driven by the data, particularly around IMD, and at least that's the question. That's what should be happening or would expect to happen at the class level. Some movements, but not huge. Whether that plays out for more extreme authorities at the edges of distribution, that remains to be seen, but we don't expect things to be completely different, and the changes in that extent should be fairly limited, at least at class level. But we know as well that there's pressure on ministers to limit losses in Inner London, and to give a better outcome to metropolitan and urban authorities. So clearly balancing those two things, ministers won't want to make changes that are huge, but at the same time they'll want to make sure that they can make changes that favour the authorities that they want to help out, particularly in Inner London and in the metropolitan authorities. So there are some scheduled updates that we know and are expecting, confirmation around the quantum and the phasing, leading from the spending review 25 and new burdens, but also the data updates that we know are going to happen, the mid-24 population estimates and the latest IMD from 2025. And then there are a whole range of ministerial judgments that we don't know that will happen, but because of kind of the speculation that we think may happen, changes in the weighting of remoteness, changes in the way population is measured, both daytime and resident, and also maybe changes to update the weightings of the foundation formula and the children's RNF, largely as a result of the IMD being so different, and requiring changes in the weightings within the formula. So there's quite a lot of stuff that we do know is going to happen, and there's a lot of stuff that we just don't know about yet. As you'll have seen in our emails and a briefing note last week, we looked at the mid-24 population estimates, which came out at the end of July, and also the release of the IMD 2025, which came out on the 30th of October. As you've been aware, there were some really big changes in methodology, which lead to lower relative deprivation scores in METs and a shift in the measured deprivation towards London and to a lower degree towards county areas as well. The big change really is that the IMD, the income domain within IMD, now takes into account housing costs. So it measures relative deprivation as households with lower than 70% of income levels after those housing costs have been applied. And as you might imagine, housing costs are higher in London and the South East in particular, and that leads to a higher relative measure of deprivation in those areas. The chart on the right looks at our assessment of what the changes in funding might be as a result of the new IMD and population. This just looks at the upper tier here, and you can see Met's losing potentially for just the foundation formula by 80 million. Outer London boroughs gaining quite substantially, 65 million. Shire counties gaining by 44, and Inner London losing a bit. But I think the key thing here is not that Inner London's losing; it's losing by a lot less than we would have expected. We would have expected Inner London to lose very significantly if there'd been no methodology change. The second chart here is looking at the impact of those factors, IMD and population, on on the lower tier foundation formula. So you see there on the far right, shire districts gaining by about 39-40 million. So what this tells us broadly is that the IMD has resulted in a different outcome for Mets in particular than we expected. We had expected the new IMD to shift more resources, more funding towards the Mets and away from London in particular, but also away from counties too. And that hasn't happened. Our estimate is the combined impact of IMD for the Mets in just the foundation formula is about 150 million, offset by a small gain from population. Population change was higher on average in Mets than it is in the rest of the country. So a small gain from population, which offsets a much larger loss for Mets from the IMD. And there will, of course, be further losses in the children's RNF if and when the EDACI index is updated as well. Within children's, we've not been able to model that, so we just don't know what the impact is of that. So our estimate is on just the foundation formula of about a loss of about 150 million for Mets, which I think, talking to others who've modelled this, seems to be similar to what they've got as well. So it looks like that's the kind of shift from that factor alone. Interestingly, major gains for Outer London again. As we sort of commented on at the beginning of this session, Outer London did really quite well from those June consultation proposals. So this just makes it even more favourable for most Outer London boroughs. So a big shift towards Outer London. So it's not just a London doing badly story. Outer London's doing really well. It's Inner London where the problems are. But the effect of the new IMD methodology is that it mitigates what would have been really big further cuts in funding for Inner London. And then, as I say here, moderate gains for county areas, probably more than we would have expected, and more than counties would have expected as well. As you probably remember, that the IMD is also used within the resources deduction. We assume that IMD will be updated within there as well. It's used to estimate the cost of local council tax support schemes. So that, based on our modelling, shifts a little bit of funding towards Outer London, about 11 million, and also towards shire counties, again about 11 million, and takes away about 10 million pounds from metropolitan authorities. So it's not as big a shift in funding in the resources deduction as we expect to be the case within the RNFs as well. The council tax base data has been released a bit earlier than normal, so we'd expect CTB1 25 data to be included within the modelling as well, and within the numbers that will be available alongside the policy statement. And we've started to analyse that, and we'll have that ready to put into our model next week as well. The average increase in tax base per the resources deduction definition of tax base is 0.47% growth. Some big movements are in places. Manchester's tax base falls by 3.8%. So well done, Manchester, for getting everything sorted out and getting as lower tax base as possible. Newcastle under Lyme down by 1.3%, Reading down by just short of 1%. Biggest increases, Salford up by 2%, Melton up by 1.96%, Hartlepool up by 1.9%, Tewkesbury up by 1.6%, Preston up by 1.6% as well. So really, I don't yet know what the impact would be on funding, but those changes would suggest that Manchester's resources deduction will be quite a bit lower, Salford's will be quite a bit higher. Then we look at remoteness. This is one of the changes that has been mentioned in the speculation in the media. It was an uplift that was developed under the previous government, and it's proposed that it would be used in the June consultation. We've not been able to isolate the impact of remoteness on people's RNFs, but we've had to go at estimating what the net gain is on the new ACA compared to the 13-14 one. The remoteness change was based on strong theoretical, has a strong theoretical basis, i.e. economic theory really strongly supports the fact that this is a good something that should be adjusted for within the area cost adjustment. In other words, that unit costs will be higher in authorities that are more remote from markets. In other words, there's lower competition, which leads to higher unit costs. So there's a good theoretical economic theory basis for having a remoteness indicator. The question was what the weighting should be, and government saying that it needed more evidence to justify what the weighting ought to be. And as we understand it, I think quite a lot of county authorities supplied evidence to support having a remoteness adjustment. But given the amount of speculation and some of the comments that are reported within the press, we'd expect the weighting to be lower as a result of ministerial judgment. But we wouldn't expect it to be removed simply because it's got such a strong theoretical basis. So trying to work out what the impact would be on individual authorities is really difficult. First of all, because we can't be clear what we can't isolate specifically what the effect is of the remoteness indicator. But looking on the right-hand side there, these are the authorities on the right that have got the highest remoteness factors. These are the upper tier authorities. So the Isle of Wight's got the highest remoteness factor. We thought it gained by about 16 million from the new ACA. Cornwall, second highest. Our estimates were that Cornwall was gaining almost 74 million pounds from the new ACA. So any change in remoteness will affect places like Cornwall, places like the Isle of Wight, Westmoreland, Herefordshire, Somerset, etc., potentially quite significantly. Some of those gains, though, will be from factors other than remoteness. Some of the gains that we see on the right there will be from things like the accessibility update or changes in the data as well. But I'd expect that quite a large chunk of some of those gains will be as a result of remoteness, and as a result, I think they are at risk of any changes that ministers might make in the weighting of remoteness within the RNFs. One of the key things in that June consultation was that virtually all the grants within core spending power will be rolled into SFA in 26-27, and the guidance we were given by MHCLG was that those grants would be distributed within SFA using the overall needs assessment share. So whatever your overall needs assessment was, that's what the share of those grants is that you were rolled in. And that was quite confusing because obviously it meant that what appeared to be the case that, say, shire districts or fire authorities were getting a share of the social care grants. But in technical terms, what was happening was that the weightings of the RNFs made sure that in reality, authorities with, say, no share of any of the adult RNF got no share of the rolled in social care grants. So our modelling is still done on that basis, but I've got a suspicion potentially that some of the rolled in grants will be distributed on a different basis, particularly the social care grants, for instance, and particularly some of the new burdens funding. So some of the things that get rolled in, I think, will be done on a different basis, but I think probably MHCLG we're just keeping it simple to start off with. But that does have quite big consequences for authorities that don't get a share of some of the rolled in grants that are done on a different basis. So that's one to really look out for. We also need to get confirmation about what the business rate retention roll-in will be. Our forecast is that it's worth just shy of 1.5 billion based on the 25-26 NNDR1. And we understand they're going to continue using the NNDR1 for the current financial year, but we need to see what government's estimate is of what that roll-in will be and how they've actually calculated that. Is it before or after levies? Does it include other elements within retained rates? And also the value of the cap compensation roll-in, and particularly the inclusion or the exclusion of any growth and cap compensation from the 100% pilot authority. So there's still quite a lot to understand there about what gets rolled in from the business rate system. Then grants outside SFA. Again, the guidance to us was that to assume that there would be no change in distribution. And our view actually was that it was quite likely that these grants outside SFA would have a new distribution basis applied to them, particularly those where there is a new RNF within the SFA. It would be kind of perverse to continue with grants outside SFA that used the old RNFs while using the new ones within SFA. And also we need more information about the quantum or the growth for these funding streams. We don't know what they would be over the next 3 years. So that's quite an important factor. But my guess is that they will use the new RNFs for the Children's Social Care Prevention Grant, the LA BCG, and the Homelessness Prevention Grant. Less likely that they would use new distribution basis for the Public Health Grant. But in our modelling at the moment, you can see the impact of all those different distribution bases on those really important grants. There's a lot of money still outside SFA. Also looking ahead to the bespoke settlements, the GLA one obviously crucially important to the GLA itself, but also because the GLA is so big, that's got consequences for the whole settlement. So finding out exactly what the GLA gets and what that means for the rest of the sector is really important. For the Isles of Scilly, the allocation will be determined by negotiation between the Isles of Scilly and the government, a much smaller figure, obviously, and that won't have any material impact at all on the settlement as a whole. But clearly, the Isles of Scilly want to get the best settlement they possibly can from that negotiation. So some predictions and speculation, kind of pulling some of that together, really. As I said at the beginning, we are still expecting only limited change. That consultation paper in June, as far as we're concerned, it really sets the parameters for funding distribution for next year and beyond. And I think going much beyond those parameters would leave MHCLG open to challenge. You know, that was a major consultation to do something very different. I think would be quite a risky proposition for MHCLG. Updating population and the 25 IMD is inevitable. They will change, and that will result in changes in distribution, and that could be potentially significant for some authorities. I mean, we've just looked at some of the overall changes at class level, but some individual authorities have seen some really big reductions in IMD. You know, Leeds, for instance, is one where its IMD score has dropped and its ranking has dropped quite significantly. So whilst things may stay fairly static or not move that much at the class level, there could be some individual authorities who are very significantly affected, both upwards and downwards. These new distributions, particularly the IMD, will help to minimise losses in inner London and, well, particularly for outer London as well. But they will further reduce those funding gains that we already saw for metropolitan areas. And there's quite a big, I think, political choice there for ministers to make about what other changes they want to make in the rest of the funding formulas to offset what's happening from the updated population and from the 2025 IMD. And about that, we just don't know anything yet. And those options are really quite limited, but I think they might include things like reduce the remoteness uplift within the ACA. If they were to do this, that wouldn't generate significant amounts of money, but it would have a very significant negative impact on a small number of county authorities. Those ones we saw in the chart on the previous slide, they could be very negatively affected. And I think what would be particularly unfair for those authorities is that, you know, the news about that would be coming very, very late in the process. You know, only just over a month before the provisional settlement. You know, the outcomes for those very remote authorities could be very different from those that we were modelling back in June. Then reviewing the weightings within the foundation formula and the children's ONF in response to the new IMD. The discretion here is probably quite limited because the new weightings should be based on regression, but there might be some scope for ministers to make changes, particularly if they could change things to benefit metropolitan authorities, for instance. And then the other bespoke changes in distribution that might be available to ministers, things like around daytime population measures, for instance, and also around the rolled-in grants, distributing those on different bases to help different types of authorities. So I think change at class level will be limited. I'd expect Mets to get a slightly improved outcome and outer London to get an improved outcome as well. But how ministers achieve that, we just don't know yet. So just looking ahead to the policy statement, on the day of the statement itself, we'll issue you with a full on-the-day briefing with some analysis about what the changes are at class level. And then the day after, there'll be a follow-up briefing with more analysis. And on the day after, at 2 o'clock, we'll also have a full webinar so we can talk about what's been announced, what the impacts are, etc. My plan is that we get an updated MTFP model out within a day. So the day after would be my ideal, but it could be a couple of days depending on the complexity of the updates. If it's a straightforward update to the RNFs and the key metrics within, say, the quantum or resources deduction, it'll be the next day. If it's more complicated, it will take a couple of days, but I will get it to you as soon as we possibly can. Okay, and Stuart, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Tour de force as usual. We can probably stop sharing slides if that's
yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So thank you very much for inviting me back. It's really good to be here. What I thought we might do is we spend a few moments focusing on Fair Funding Review 2.0, as it's dubbed, and in particular where we are now, what we think is going to come next, and on the scope for manoeuvre with the proposals that are on the table. So first of all, where we are. So as Adrian's remarks show, this is a very large exercise and it's massively complicated and interlinking. This is not a straightforward consultation, and it's not a straightforward exercise to decide how to respond to that. And that's even more so when you consider the timetable that we've all been working to. So this latest 2.0 exercise was launched in December last year. The main consultation was in June. And we expect a policy statement very shortly, and that will only come just a few weeks before a provisional settlement on the usual timings quote, which it probably means in December, just before Parliament rises for recess, and that's basically driven by the budget timing, as I'll come back to later. And what we'll see in December is actually in formal terms a 1-year settlement. The powers that exist and the material that Parliament will be asked to vote on is just a 1-year settlement, but it'll be framed within a 3-year settlement. So the information about the later 2 years will be available, and those will be in effect indicative allocations or promises by ministers that that's what they intend to deliver for years 2 and 3, or at least at the minimum, that's what they'll deliver. And the aim of all this, of course, is to win the vote in Parliament. That's the crucial test. More than many other areas of public policy, this goes to a vote in Parliament, and it's do or die in early February. So there needs to be some confidence to have the numbers, even with a very large majority, to get that through. And of course, just to say in passing, this is a much broader endeavour than it is usually. It takes in, for example, the consolidated specific grants that Adrian mentioned: homelessness and rough sleeping, public health, crisis and resilience, and children's, families and youth. So those are new creations that we haven't seen before. And there are lots of changes to business rates, retention and other policy areas. So overall then, this is a very rapid process over a calendar year, and especially when you consider the broad approach that there is. In terms of the overall approach that's been adopted, I would say it's pretty unusual. We've got to a very late stage in the process with no numbers on pound allocations to date. We've had some need shares, but that only takes you some way. We haven't got numbers on the resources equalisation. We haven't got numbers on the transition, and a lot of the phrasing throughout has been pretty ambiguous, requiring lots of interpretation by Adrian and others. And whether this is unconscious, just because it's the way that things have been drafted, or whether it's actually conscious to avoid being explicit until the last possible minute, or to keep options open, is something that you will have a view on. It certainly seems clear the department's been retaining information at various points, holding it back from exposing it to public scrutiny. And they could, for example, have frozen data earlier at the cost of up-to-date accuracy and been a bit more transparent. And what that would have meant was that you would have had more notice for the outcome in the coming settlement and to use in your budgeting process. But what we have instead is a back-end loaded process for a short, heavily laden consultation in December. So the whole thing has been, in a sense, for me, a very curious game of charades, where the department's made various gestures and people in the sector have been trying to interpret those gestures and saying back to the department, well, is this what you mean? And they've said, well, you've got 2 of the 3 syllables right, but you have to keep guessing what the third one is. It's been a very, very strange process to this point. So what's next? What have they been up to, and what will we see now? They will have had hundreds of responses to the consultation. They would have read and logged them all in detail, perhaps even 2 people reading every response and independently logging it. They'll have developed answers to all of the issues raised in consultation internally. And whether that means reiterating the original arguments, so just deciding not to respond to the specifics, or whether it means amending consultation arguments, or whether it means developing new proposals in response to what's been put forward in the responses. There's a range of possible outcome. But in particular, they'll be interested in the broad thrust of the representation. So, for example, what are the different associations saying? What are the different regions of the country saying? Where is the opposition coming from? And who is likely to be able to galvanise MPs when the whole thing moves into the parliamentary arena? One of the ways to approach these exercises, and I'm not suggesting the department will do this, but you can think of it in terms of something for everyone. So you make a change which allows you to respond to any argument put by anyone across the country, that there's something in this for them. That doesn't mean that everyone will be equally happy, but you're giving a nod to all the different responses in developing the response document, which is eventually published. So that's the first thing on the consultation. There's also been substantial data and formula updates and a wealth of outstanding policy decisions that were undertaken in June. So we've just seen the new index of multiple deprivation, and it's very likely, I would have thought, that that's incorporated into the formulas, and that the formulas will be updated in terms of their weightings as a result of that. I think we've seen some very strong hints today that will be the case. Equally, population estimates, our new population estimates are available. There's a new council tax base that could well be brought into action. And as I said, lots and lots of policy decisions, from things as basic as how do we use the resources from the spending review? How much are we allocating to the core settlement? How much for the individual specific grants? Basic things like, will we use data projections for population and council tax base, for example? Some big questions on the operation of business rates retention, for example, on the levy and safety net. And then perhaps most important of all for the immediate impact in the first year is how exactly will the transition work, which has been left quite ambiguous to this point. The budget will be on the 26th of November. We certainly expect to see the multipliers for the coming year confirmed at that point, and a much more complicated arrangement because of retail and hospitality multipliers and additional surcharges for the larger businesses to pay for the retail and hospitality discount. So that's yet more complexity in this area. We would often be looking out for the possibility of extra resources at that point. That seems very unlikely, of course, given the sort of general commentary and the pitch rolling that the government's been doing in the run up to the budget. But of course, it's an interesting question when it gets into Parliament whether there'll be a need to introduce further resources at that point to make sure that the vote is safe in February. And then the department will move to final decisions, and they'll need to clear those with other interested departments. So Treasury in particular, but also the Health Department, Education, Transport, DEFRA, and the Home Office all have a substantial say in all this. And then there's once the decisions are taken, there's a massive quality assurance exercise which can last as long as 2 weeks, and which involves independent checking of the data and the formulas by people in the department who are not directly involved in the original calculations, and also random sampling of representative authorities. But there must be considerable risk of errors given the size and scope of this exercise. And another thing that's worth just musing about at this point is, of course, halfway through this exercise, 2 new ministers got involved. That's bad news for the department, not least because they have to get the new ministers up to speed with something that their predecessors have been working on for months. But also, of course, it's quite plausible that the new ministers will have different views on the way forward than their predecessors, and then there's a process of trying to unpick what's been done already and work out how to take that forward now. Okay, so let's focus now on the scope for manoeuvre. In terms of the overall outcome that we've got here, there's been a very long delay since the last review, and a great deal has changed, both in the financial position of individual authorities after I think it's 7 one-year tactical settlements, but also in terms of circumstances on the ground, your population and all the other factors that come into the needs assessments, and your council tax base as well, of course. So all of that means is that we see some very large changes in allocations, and we also see a wide change in any group that you care to identify. So whether it's a class of authority or a region of the country, there's very wide range of outcomes for these groups, and also they tend to overlap with other groups in a way that's you might not expect at first sight. And on top of that, there are significant individual outliers that you need to cope with, either in the allocation process or even more so in the transition process. So what will the department be thinking about where they are at this point? Well, the first thing to remember, of course, that this is about distributing a fixed amount of money. So there isn't new money here, almost certainly. And there are only really 3 big pieces of the jigsaw that determine the outcome, that really drive the outcome, and that's the outcome for the Mets, for counties, and for London boroughs. The districts, of course, very important in this process, but the amounts of money that are going in that direction are relatively small. So. And there are ways to settle the outcome for districts that are kind of independent of the bigger picture for the first 3 groups of authorities. So they'll be focusing in particular on the first 3 groups of authorities. And this is going to be a challenging position for everyone, even those who are relative winners, but especially so if you're on the flat cash funding floor or even below that floor. This is going to be very difficult. Notwithstanding that, as a starting point, and this is quite difficult to kind of explain, and it's also a bit difficult to hear, but the department might feel in general terms they're in a reasonably good place with an outcome that is reasonably balanced across the sector as a whole, that they haven't completely misjudged the allocations, and they haven't biased it in a particular direction that will lead it to be unstable. So if that's their starting point, what does the consultation tell us? Well, everyone has argued their corner very, very strongly, of course. I think you could say that London has been particularly loud, and the Mets have been disappointed with the way it's played out from their perspective. So that's probably 2 things the department has in mind. But there are real constraints on the changes you can make. The levers are very, very clumsy, and they're difficult to use effectively or in a targeted way. The making changes at this point is heavily constrained by the resources for implementation. There are no new resources. It's a zero-sum game. It's also constrained by the financial resilience across the sector. You can't have serious losers who will then be in financial difficulty. You're also constrained by the prospects of local government reorganisation and the need to avoid creating new authorities that are immediately financially unstable. We're working at pace here, and consultation for the December consultation period will be very short. So they need to watch not to unbalance things too much against that background, I would suggest. And also, there's a question of political capital. There's Labour representation for MPs across the country now, more so after the last election. So there are more people to try and keep on side in deciding what to do. So it may be that we see a bit of a triumph of pragmatism over ideology. But against that, there is a need to respond to the representations to this point and the likely representations in future. So we've gone through some of the constraints on change, and there's a further one, of course, which is the principles for the whole exercise, which were set out last December, and in essence talk about transparent, evidence-based proposals. And that together would seem to me to place significant limitations on the changes following consultation. Remember, you've already maxed out two of the key levers. So the first of those is it looks as though there will be 100% business rates retention growth reset. So if you pinch your colours to that mast, it is difficult to reduce that, and you certainly can't increase it. We're also having full council tax resources equalisation. Similar considerations apply. Difficult for them to reduce, certainly can't increase it. Housing costs will come into the picture rather more. We've already got a temporary accommodation indicator. Housing costs are more prominent in IMD, and that will certainly feed into the foundation formula and probably into the children's formula as well. There's lots of commitments here outside the department's control. So IMD, population numbers, council tax base, they're all essentially things that are visited on the team that's doing this with really no control over the outcome. So they basically have to deal with those. One thing I will mention, which has had a lot of coverage in the technical press, is the remoteness weighting in the ACA. This, as Adrian mentioned, this deals with service market failure in the more remote areas of the country, and there's a very strong economic theoretical basis for this. We know this happens, but at all stages in the development, it's been difficult to identify hard evidence to help you establish what weighting you place on this, how important it is in relation to other factors that determine costs of services across the country. So according to the press coverage, it looks as though the remoteness indicator within the area cost adjustment will survive, but its weighting may be reduced within the overall ACA. So that's kind of it, really, where we are now. We await the document with some anticipation next week. Looking at the proposals that are on the table from June, it does look as though the scope for change, on average at least, is heavily constrained, but they will need to find some way to respond to some quite strong representations. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stuart. Thank you very much. Yeah, we do. We wait eagerly with anticipation, don't we, to see what's going to come out. I've got a few final slides before we finish, looking ahead to the autumn budget and then looking to the BRS and changes in business rates. So a few things, and there's a comment from Nick from North Yorks in the chat as well. If indeed the policy statement is next week, it was the week before the autumn budget. was working on the basis that it wouldn't be so close and it wouldn't be before. It would be prudent to wait to see what was in the autumn budget and then release a policy statement the week after. But that doesn't appear to be the case. I don't think, though, it necessarily rules out the fact there could be things that happen in the autumn budget that could affect the settlement. There could be more money, there could be less money, there could be new burdens, new policy changes, and all those things I think could affect the settlement itself. I think we'll just have to run through the structure of the new SFA and how it's calculated. Some things could be more controversial and far-reaching. Council tax bans, higher weightings or new bans. We'll talk about that in the next slide. As Stuart mentioned, there will now be 5 business rate multipliers in total. Each of those needs to be set. Some will be frozen, no doubt. Some will be capped. Some will be fully indexed. So quite a lot of movement around the multipliers, and potentially a new cap compensation system. You thought you got rid of cap compensation, but I think it may come back if indeed they do decide to cap or freeze some of the multipliers. But we don't know what the reference rate would be. We don't know what the rate at which normal indexation was expected to take place. So we don't quite know how that would work if it carries on again. A lot of talk in the press about there being employers' national insurance contributions on employers' pension contributions, 15% that would be. That could be quite a significant sum for every authority. Will there be additional funding? Any funding for Ascend? I think the white paper is due in the new year, so I don't think anyone's expecting any funding, but there could be some indication about what ministers want to do there. Additional council tax bans, though, could be quite a big deal. And there's been quite a lot of coverage, and quite a lot of positive coverage, actually, from places like the FT, from IFS, and other respected commentators. 2 options there would be, one, adding new bans, which I think is probably unlikely, or increasing, maybe doubling the weighting of the upper 2 bands, G and H. Doubling the weighting, I think, could be implemented quickly. It's administratively fairly easy, although I'm sure revenues teams will say it's more complicated than that. Whereas the new bands, I think, will probably take 2, maybe more years, and I think they would require revaluations within for all properties within G&H to work out what the new bands are that they will go into. That's much more complicated. So I think if they do anything, it's much more likely to be about doubling or increasing the weighting for G&H. And I think in terms of the mechanics of it, I think additional taxation revenues, if there were any, I think could be extracted via the proposed SFA calculations. I think what they could do is just allow more of the core spending power to be financed by locally raised taxation, and less of it to be financed from grant increases, and for the resorted deduction to take the strain and effectively reflect the increased revenues from council tax. I'm not sure what the legal status would be of local authorities actually making a direct payment of council tax to central government. I don't quite know how that works, if indeed it would. And then quite clearly, the distribution of homes in band G and H is going to be heavily skewed towards South East England and to some extent towards London as well. So it would really change things quite significantly. So some quotes there, extracts from the FT article, which was really insightful. Saying that George Osborne had looked at a similar sort of scheme previously, and had looked at a mechanism to ensure that the extra revenues flowed to the Treasury, not to local authorities, and that he favoured using bans. So you've got to assume that the Treasury kind of thinking is pretty similar. The targeted approach seems more likely, and the simplest, as we said, would be simply doubling the council tax rates on properties in the highest two bands, G and H. The alternative would be more complicated, and we understand the chancellor's looking for things that are more administratively easy to implement. So that's one to really look out for. But my guess would be that the intention would be that it raises money for the Treasury and doesn't generate additional funding for local authorities. The business rates retention scheme, lots of changes. Stuart mentioned in his section, and also Martin's have mentioned in the chat as well, a whole lot of changes around levy rates and thresholds, which we briefed on and already updated our model for. Safety net and threshold changes potentially. The baseline reset accompanied by new business rate baselines based on gross rates minus accounting adjustments rather than the net rates calculation. And then Section 31 grants paying for all reliefs, including charitable and empty property relief. So a very different structure to the way that the retention scheme works. Then cap compensation, as I mentioned, potentially starting up again from 26-27, then the multipliers in the budget. Business rates pools, you've got a deadline of the 24th of November. If you have enough growth, then the business rate pool could work. It could be worth having. I have a quick poll. Let's see if this works. Asking you if you're thinking about a business rates pool. So if you're an area that's, I guess, really two-tier area, any area could be interested in a pool because of the change in the way the levies would work. So can you see that? Does that work? Oh, there we are. So 80% more or less not considering a pool next year. So not surprisingly, given the uncertainty, yeah, most authorities are probably going to steer clear for a year. Second one, if you are considering, are you going to change membership? But half saying no, half saying haven't considered. And I mean, I think that's probably fair enough, and I think that's probably what we'll see in the end. Most authorities waiting for a year to see what the new system looks like, and also waiting for growth to build up. There's no point having a business rate pool if you've got no growth. You're just bringing on more risk without any gains. So that's interesting to see that. Business rate pilots, we're waiting for a decision in the autumn budget. Only GM and West Midlands have got confirmation as yet. My guess is they'll continue again, but we don't know. The key point, though, in terms of business budget planning is there's so much change. There's so many interacting factors and changes that will happen. Our guidance really would be that the model as it's currently set up will give you an idea about what you ought to be getting out of the system in the future. And the bottom line basically is that you won't get any above baseline growth as at the 1st of April 2025. So there'll be lots of movements here, offsetting one another, and changes in the baseline tariffs and top-ups, etc. But in essence, all the business rate growth that you've got to date, as at the 31st of March, will disappear, and as at the 1st of April, you'll be at baseline. You may get growth during the year, which will be additional, but effectively your starting point will be no business rate growth as at the 1st of April. You'll be at baseline. It's quite a full slide, but I thought it'd be worth just sharing with you that we've been talking with the business rate team at MHCLG, with others as well, like LG Futures. The business rate team is very open and really try to help us understand what to expect. But obviously, there's a lot we don't know for certain yet. This was my email, or a summarized version of my email back to the business rate team, effectively saying these are the things that we need to know about to be able to change the model, to change our MTFP model. So there's a whole range of things here that we're looking for. We're looking for guidance on. Most things are either being developed in a working paper, or they're awaiting for a ministerial decision, or we just don't know when the data will be available. But this kind of sets out what our thinking is. And I think one of the key things to draw from this is that we won't really be able to fully update the MTFP model for the new changes in business rates until we've seen the NNDR1. That's the only point at which we'll know what your income looks like for 26, 27. And I think that's the point at which would, usefully we'll be able to make all the changes going through the model. But clearly, I want to make sure that the model that you've got at the time of the provisional settlement is a model that's functional and gives you as much information as possible about how the business rate system will work and what that means for your budgets. But if you've got any questions about that, just let me know. And then finally, just to let you know that Andrew is continuing to do good work on the Pixel benchmarking service, constantly developing new features, new elements to it, bringing in new bits of data. So it's a constantly growing service. So if you've not looked at it to date, give Andrew a bell and speak to him about it. We've got some more things that he's developing as well for the future, and we are going to plan a webinar for the 25th of November. I will send out details tomorrow, just to let you know when it is, and you can start to register for that. But just to let you know that lots going on there still, and you're welcome to ask questions of me or Andrew and have a look. Okay, so that's the slides. Thanks to Stuart for your section, Stuart. And over to you. Any questions or thoughts? It's a fairly overwhelming process, I think. Lots and lots to know about. Martin, Martin Mitchell, you made some comments there about. I know you had some comments about the GLA. Are you saying there that you expect the GLA's funding to be announced provisionally in the policy statement, or do you think it's not till the provisional?
Well, I think we're not really sure at this stage. I mean, obviously we've had negotiations with MHCLG, so obviously final decision will need to be made by ministers, and whether that will be announced in the policy statement. I'm assuming there'll be some sort of guidance, but as you sort of highlighted in your model, there's the sort of fire element, obviously, which is subject to a national funding form, and the rest of it, the other 85%, 90% is obviously bespoke funding for Transport for London, GLA, primarily small amount of police funding from council tax freeze that obviously is agreed separately. So there obviously like to be different treatments for those two elements, but what they'll announce, we're not really clear, because it's more, I suppose, like to be a methodology rather than numerical sums. So as is the case for all authorities, so we'll just have to wait and see what's announced in the policy statement.
Yeah, because as you know, Martin, it's a very much a zero-sum game, isn't it, between the GLA and the rest of the sector? If you get more, everyone else gets less, and vice versa.
Yeah, and obviously there's the interaction with the fire funding formula as well. So obviously that'll be an issue for that sector too. So not really much I can say apart from MHCLG will announce any deal if it exists in due course, I assume.
Yeah, fair enough. That's good. That's good. Cheers, Martin. And you mentioned as well that the over 20% of the Band H properties in England are in just two authorities, Westminster and K&C.
And well, I think it's nearly half in London overall. I think it's about 47% are in London in terms of Band H, but there are obviously, as I previously highlighted, lots of quirks because of obviously the fact that we're rating to 1991. So we're still in a situation where Barnsley has more Band H properties than Hackney. I'm sure if you did a revaluation now, there's more Band H properties in Shoreditch than the whole of South Yorkshire. But so if you just take the current Band H's to do this mansion tax, if it is going to go ahead, it may not necessarily be the most equitable approach, but obviously that's a matter for the Treasury and the Chancellor. So we don't even know if it's going to happen. So
no. My favourite stat, Martin, was that the old Glasgow City Council under its old boundaries only had one Band H property.
Yeah, well, Barking and Dagenham isn't far off that. It's only got 14, but I'm sure they're doing their bits. So, but time.
Give it time. Exactly. Cheers, Martin. Catherine asking, will there be any additional consultation around the business rate system? I think what I'd expect to see is a full paper explaining what the proposals are to come out alongside the policy statement, to be honest, Catherine. That's what I expect. I mean, any later than that, really, we're waiting for the provisional settlement, which I think is just too late. So I'm pretty sure we'd see something alongside the policy statement. But even if that's a full paper, it's not going to give us any numbers as yet. As I said in that slide towards the end of the slide set, there's quite a lot of the choreography around when the new draft rating list is available, when the new baselines are available. All that stuff is not going to line up very neatly over the next few months. Mark asking about is it still an open question about whether the 2019 or 25 IMDs will be used? I'd be amazed if it's anything other than the 2025 IMD. I mean, I think it's almost as close as certain as you can get. I don't know what you think, Stuart, but I can't see them not. There's no question of them not using the 25 IMD.
Yeah, I agree. One of the original principles of the review was to use the most up-to-date data. And there's been quite a lot of informal signalling to this point that they were waiting for the new IMD, which of course has been announced quite conveniently just in advance of the policy statement. So I would expect that to be drawn in, and people have also talked at different times about reweighting the formulas, which I think is necessary. Really, you can't just bring the new IMD in on a like-for-like basis. You do have to sort of go back to the design of the formula and reweight them. Yeah,
and I agree, Stuart. And it would be perverse not to use it, especially after taking the heat of actually making a big methodology change and then not using it would be quite strange. And I think that, I mean, what do you use? Do you go back to 2019? That would be it'd be very strange, I think.
Also, there's been quite a lot of pressure to reflect housing costs in the review generally, deprivation in particular, and changes in the benefit system have meant for the first time that analysts in government have been able to incorporate housing costs into the IMD in a way that wasn't possible before. So, you know, to take advantage of that change, again, you would want to use the new indices.
Yeah, I agree, Stuart. Tony asking about is there a definitive list of all the councils and their IMD? Paul, thanks for the posting the link as well. Tony, I sent out a spreadsheet last week, which I think you might be able to use as well. It's got all the every authority with their IMD score and ranking. Although I have got in there both upper tier and lower tier together, so that might not necessarily make ranking that easy, but at least you'll be able to see everything all together if that would be of any use. But if not, just drop me a line. But any other questions or comments people want to make? Oh, something more coming through. Neil, any assumptions on public health grant? Assuming 3.2 in line with DH, yeah, I think that's probably not a bad assumption. I've not heard anything, and I think public health teams tend to be a bit slow on getting numbers to us and figures. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assumption, Neil, that it goes up in line with the NHS funding allocation. I think I've probably got it cash flat at the moment. And I think, if I recall rightly, I think the non-NHS funding within the spending review is a bit lower. So I'm not quite sure how they'll allocate funding between NHS and non-NHS elements within DH, but I think 3.2 is a reasonable assumption. And as well, I can't imagine them. I think it's probably unlikely, Stuart, for them to use that new formula they developed. It's over a decade old now, anyway.
Yes. Yeah, indeed, it's not that new, and it hasn't been properly consulted on. So I'm really, and it was developed under the previous administration. So it's just too remote from day to day at the moment to be used, which is a shame, I think. And then, of course, there is a more general question here. As you say, the public health allocations have typically come out after the final settlement, very, very late in the process, very close to the new financial year. So that there will be these 4 large consolidated grants. So it's an open question, I think, and there's been some ambiguity again about this as to whether those 4 grants will be available at the provisional settlement. And even whether they are inside some measure of spending power, you know, because some of the grants in there, I think, are, and others are not. But the department's not been very explicit about this. They've used the term new spending power at times, but they've even referred to CSP at other times. Are they the same? Are they different? It's not clear to me. So I don't know whether we'll get the 4 grants in December, or whether they'll come out at some point, some later point.
Yeah, and actually that links into Brett's question there about that our model doesn't have the children's social care prevention. It's got the children's social care prevention grant, but the children's and families grant, which will form one of those 4 consolidated grants. So I mean, that's, you know, we need to draw that into our modelling. But I think your point stands as well there, Stuart, that if the government's going to announce that it's got 4 consolidated grants, it needs to have the allocations within them. I'd imagine available at the provisional. It would be odd to say we're still waiting for key grants. You know, public health is 3.8 billion. It's not a minor grant. It's not a small grant. It's a big piece of money.
You'd certainly hope so, and of course it will help them in their overall selling of the funding reform package if they can bring in these large amounts of resources in support. Again, it's back to this idea of something for everyone. You know, if you're doing badly out of the core settlement, then perhaps you're doing a bit better out of one of the or more of the 4 big grants, and they can point your attention in that direction.
That's true. Yeah, it could be one of the ways they sort of deal with some of the issues around funding for METs, for instance, or changes in METs authorities looking at those other grants too. And Brett, that's something I will bring in more of those grants for that are within the consolidated grants as much as we can to give as full a picture as possible. But I think one thing we'll be looking for in the policy statement is whether they do issue a new formal definition of spending power, or whether they run with a couple. They run with the core spending power and they would run with the wider spending power. So that's something we'll be definitely looking at in the next couple of weeks. Great stuff. We'll probably draw a line under it there then. So we will be looking forward, hopefully, to the policy statement next week, whenever it is next week, and then the autumn budget the week after. So as I said, we'll do a full on the day briefing when the policy statement comes out. We'll have a webinar the day after at 2 o'clock, and then we will update the model as soon as we can after that. How fast we're able to do it just depends on how complicated the changes are that come out of the policy statement. But obviously, I know you'll want to get an updated version. Paul, thank you very much. That you can't wait for the new version of the MTFP model. Yeah, we've all got we're all excited. Thank you, Stuart. Thanks to everyone for coming along. There'll be a recording on the website tomorrow morning as well. Thank you, everyone. Cheers. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.